The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of money and lilies, a suffocating perfume of success. Hundreds of New York's elite glided across the marble floor, their laughter like the clinking of champagne glasses, hollow and bright. But for Amelia Hayes, the room had shrunk to a single searing point of focus. Her ex-husband, Marcus, stood before her, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Beside him, clinging to his arm, was Isabel, the woman who had replaced her. "You can't stop us," Isabel whispered, her voice a venomous little secret. Marcus laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed with triumph. But across the room, another man, the silent and powerful Donovan Sterling, wasn't watching them. He was watching Amelia, and he saw her smile. The Metropolitan Legacy Gala was a battlefield disguised as a party. The weapons were $1,000 smiles and cutting whispers, the armor was couture, and victory was measured in who stood in the most exclusive circle of conversation. Amelia Hayes had once commanded this terrain with effortless grace. Tonight she was an intruder in her own former life. She held her glass of champagne like a shield, the cool crystal a small anchor in a sea of piranhas. She had known they would be here. Marcus Thorne would never miss an opportunity to parade his success, and his newest acquisition, Isabel Renault, was an essential part of that parade. Seeing them was like watching a car crash in slow motion, horrifying yet impossible to look away from. Marcus, with his tailored tuxedo and easy charisma, looked every bit the corporate titan she had helped create. Isabel was a vision in crimson silk, her youth and manufactured adoration a stark, painful contrast to the quiet partnership Amelia and Marcus once shared. Their approach was deliberate, a lion cornering its prey for sport. The crowd parted for them, their whispers trailing behind like the train of Isabel's gown. "Amelia," Marcus began, his voice laced with a patronizing warmth that made her skin crawl. "I'm surprised to see you out. I thought you'd still be adjusting." Adjusting. That was his word for dismantling the life they had built together, for packing her belongings into boxes while Isabel's were moved in, for the cold finality of a divorce decree that felt more like an eviction notice. "I'm quite well adjusted, Marcus." "Thank you," she replied, her voice even, betraying none of the tremor she felt in her hands. She met Isabel's gaze. The younger woman's eyes were bright with a possessive fire. This was her moment, the public coronation. "I do love what you've done with the penthouse," Isabel said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "The minimalist aesthetic is so clean. It's like the place has no history at all." It was a direct hit, and they both knew it. Every piece of art, every book, every carefully chosen piece of furniture that had told the story of Amelia's life with Marcus had been scrubbed away. Amelia gave a slight, non-committal shrug. "To each their own. I always found that history is what gives a place its soul." Marcus's smirk widened. He was enjoying this, the public display of her dispossession. He placed a proprietary hand on Isabel's waist, pulling her closer. It was then that Isabel leaned in, her perfume cloying and invasive. "He's taking me to Monaco next week," she whispered, her voice a conspiratorial hiss meant only for Amelia. "The board just approved his new compensation package. We're celebrating." She paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "You can't stop us." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering as a shard of glass. It was a declaration of total victory. And then Marcus laughed. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a deep, guttural laugh of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was the sound of a man who believed he had won everything and lost nothing of value. The sound bounced off the high, gilded ceilings, drawing glances from nearby guests who quickly looked away, sensing the raw, private cruelty of the moment. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. For a single, terrifying second, Amelia felt the sting of tears. She felt the urge to shatter her glass, to scream, to expose the ugly truth of the man beneath the polished veneer. But she didn't. Instead, something else took over. A strange, cold calm washed through her veins. She thought of the long nights spent analyzing Marcus's business plans, the sacrifices she'd made for his ambition, the intellect he had mined and then discarded. He had forgotten who she was. He saw a wife he had shed like last season's coat. He had no idea he had discarded his most valuable asset. And so Amelia Hayes smiled. It wasn't a wide, manic grin, nor was it a pained grimace. It was a small, quiet, knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but held a universe of intent within it. It was the smile of a chess master who sees the board 5 moves ahead. It was a smile that said, "You have no idea what you've just done." The laugh died in Marcus's throat, his brow furrowed in confusion. Isabel's triumphant expression faltered. Her declaration was meant to break her, but Amelia's smile was a shield it could not pierce. It was an answer to a question they hadn't known to ask. Across the cavernous room, standing near the French doors that led to the terrace, Donovan Sterling watched the entire exchange. He was a man who moved in shadows, his presence a quiet weight in any room. His empire was built on seeing what others missed, the subtle tells, the shifts in power, the hidden weaknesses. He had been observing Marcus Thorne for months, but his interest had recently shifted. He saw Marcus's cruel laughter and Isabel's smug pronouncement. But what held his attention, what truly captivated him, was the ex-wife. He watched her absorb the public blow, saw the flicker of pain she thought no one could see, and then witnessed the astonishing transformation. He saw her smile. And unlike Marcus, Donovan Sterling understood exactly what that smile meant. It wasn't an admission of defeat. It was the beginning of a war. The end didn't come like a sudden explosion. It was a slow poisoning, a gradual erosion of trust and intimacy that Amelia had failed to diagnose until the symptoms were fatal. Marcus hadn't always been a monster. The man she'd married 15 years ago was ambitious and charming, but he also possessed a vulnerability that had made her feel essential. He had dreams of building a financial empire, and she, with her keen analytical mind and background in market strategy, was not just his partner in life, but the silent architect of his ascent. Their early years were a whirlwind of shared purpose. They lived in a small walk-up apartment, their dining table buried under financial reports and prospectus drafts. Amelia had left a promising career at a top-tier consulting firm to help him launch Thorne Capital. It wasn't a sacrifice to her. It was an investment in them. She was the one who identified the undervalued tech startup that became their first major success. She was the one who crafted the meticulous presentations that won over their initial skeptical investors. Marcus was the face, the charismatic salesman. She was the engine, hidden away in the machine room, ensuring it all ran perfectly. "We're a team, Ames," he used to say, kissing her forehead as they worked late into the night. "You're my secret weapon." The poison began to seep in with success. The we slowly became I. It was no longer our first big win, but the deal I closed. When journalists wrote profiles on the meteoric rise of Thorne Capital, her name was never mentioned. At first, she told herself it didn't matter. The success was real, and she was a part of it. But then came the subtle dismissals. "Don't worry your pretty head about the quarterly reports," he'd say, even though she could recite them from memory. "You've earned a rest. Go shopping." He began to reframe her history. Her strategic brilliance was recast as wifely support. Her decision to leave her job became a story he told about how he wanted to provide for her so she wouldn't have to work. He was isolating her from her own achievements, brick by brick, until she was standing in a beautiful gilded prison of his making. The gaslighting was insidious. When she'd challenge him on a business decision, pointing out a flaw in his logic, he would accuse her of being negative, or worse, of not trusting him. "Amelia, I'm the one in the trenches every day," he'd argue, his voice patient, as if explaining something to a child. "The game has changed since you were in the business. It's more aggressive now. You wouldn't understand. She started to doubt herself. Had she lost her edge? Was he right? The confident, sharp woman who had once commanded boardrooms now found herself second-guessing every instinct. He made her feel small, and the smaller she felt, the bigger he seemed. Isabel's arrival was merely the final predictable act. Amelia discovered the affair not through a lipstick-stained collar, but through the cold, impersonal data of a credit card statement. Hotel suites in cities where Marcus had no meetings, jewelry from boutiques he'd never take her to, a sudden and extravagant paper trail of a life he was living without her. The confrontation was sterile and corporate. He didn't deny it. He treated it like a hostile takeover of their marriage. "It's just time for a change, Amelia," he said, sitting across from her in their stark white living room, the city lights glittering coldly behind him. People, like companies, sometimes need to divest from underperforming assets. The cruelty of the metaphor was breathtaking. She was an underperforming asset. 15 years of her life, her love, her intellect, reduced to a line item on a balance sheet he was eager to clear. "All those years, Marcus," she said, her voice hollow. "The nights we spent building this, does any of that mean anything to you?" "It was a different era," he replied, without a flicker of remorse. "I'm grateful for your early contributions, of course, and you will be well compensated for your time." He was offering her a severance package. He had already met with his lawyers. The divorce was a business transaction, and he had structured the deal entirely in his favor, leveraging pre-nuptial agreements she'd signed in a haze of love and trust decades ago. He was leaving her with enough money to be comfortable, but not enough to be powerful. He was ensuring she could never be a threat. In the final days, as she packed her life into boxes, she found an old notebook from the early years. It was filled with her handwriting, market analysis, investment strategies, ideas she had sketched out that had become the very pillars of Thorn Capital. On one page, she had detailed a high-risk, high-reward acquisition strategy for a niche biotech firm. At the top of the page, Marcus had written, "Too risky aims. Let's stick to what we know." She remembered the argument. He had dismissed the idea as reckless. A year later, that same biotech firm was acquired by a rival company for 10 times its initial value, a move that made headlines in the Wall Street Journal. Marcus had never mentioned it again. Staring at her own prescient analysis, a cold fury began to replace her grief. He hadn't just betrayed her as a husband, he had dismissed her as a strategist. He had taken her brilliance, used it to build his kingdom, and then locked her out when she was no longer convenient. His greatest weakness was his ego. He genuinely believed he had done it all himself. He had forgotten that his secret weapon had a mind of its own. Packing the last box, she sealed it with tape. She was not just sealing away memories of a dead marriage. She was packing away her grief, her self-doubt, her pain. She was leaving the ashes behind. And from them, a plan was beginning to rise. A plan built not on emotion, but on cold, hard data. The very language he had taught her, and then foolishly assumed she had forgotten. He thought he had won. He hadn't yet realized the game had just begun. Donovan Sterling's office was a silent testament to power. Located on the top floor of a skyscraper that pierced the heart of Manhattan, its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the city. There was no clutter, no personal photographs, only a large, imposing desk of polished obsidian and a single exquisite sculpture in the corner. Sterling himself was much like his office, minimalist, precise, and radiating an aura of untouchable control. He didn't build his multi-billion-dollar empire, Sterling Industries, with charm. He built it with logic, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to identify an opponent's breaking point. When Amelia Hayes had requested a meeting 3 weeks before the gala, his curiosity was piqued. He knew her only by name, the quiet, elegant wife of Marcus Thorn, a man Donovan considered a reckless peacock, all flash and no foundation. He had agreed to the meeting out of a mild academic interest. He allotted her 15 minutes. She walked in not as a victim seeking aid, but as a peer presenting a proposition. She was dressed in a sharp, understated business suit, her demeanor calm and professional. There were no tears, no pleas for sympathy. She carried a single, slim leather portfolio. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice steady as she took the seat he offered. "Thank you for your time. I know you and my soon-to-be ex-husband are competitors in the acquisitions market. I believe I have something that might interest you." Donovan remained silent, his steepled fingers resting beneath his chin, his eyes giving away nothing. He was a master of using silence to make others talk, to make them over-explain and reveal their weaknesses. Amelia didn't flinch. She opened her portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across the vast desk. It wasn't a plea, it was a prospectus. On it was a detailed, multi-phase strategy titled Project Downfall. It was a plan to systematically dismantle Thorn Capital. "Marcus has built his company on a foundation of aggressive, high-leverage deals," Amelia explained, her tone clinical, as if discussing a case study. "He projects an image of invincibility, but his portfolio is dangerously overexposed, particularly in the European tech sector. He's arrogant. He believes his own press. That's his weakness." Donovan's gaze flickered down to the paper, then back to her. He was intrigued now. This was not the rambling of a scorned woman. This was the cold, precise language of a high-level strategist. "And you know this how?" he asked, his voice a low baritone. "Because I wrote the original business plan for Thorn Capital," Amelia stated, without pride or resentment. It was simply a fact. "I designed the initial investment models. I know where every pillar is, which means I also know which ones are load-bearing and which ones are hollow." She proceeded to lay out her plan. It was brilliant in its subtlety. It wasn't about a single crushing blow. It was about 1,000 cuts. It involved poaching key talent Marcus had grown complacent about, exploiting regulatory loopholes in his offshore holdings she knew he overlooked, and anticipating his next big acquisition target and getting there first. Not necessarily to buy it, but to drive up the price and force him to overpay, further stretching his resources. Donovan listened, his expression unreadable. He had paid his own teams millions to find a vulnerability in Thorn's empire, and they had found nothing this incisive, this intimate. Amelia wasn't just offering him a business plan, she was handing him a psychological blueprint of his rival. "Why come to me?" he finally asked. "This is a plan for revenge. It's personal." "Of course it's personal," Amelia admitted, her professional mask cracking for just a moment to reveal a flash of steel. "He tried to erase me. He took 15 years of my life and my work and told me it was worthless. I'm not seeking to destroy him for emotional satisfaction, Mr. Sterling. I'm seeking a market correction. He is overvalued, and I intend to prove it. I have the intellectual capital, but I lack the financial resources to execute this at scale. You have the resources. And what do you get out of it?" "I don't want your money," she said firmly. "I want backing. I want to start my own advisory firm. You can be my first silent client. When Thorn Capital's key assets are devalued and ready for acquisition, your company will be in the primary position to absorb them for a fraction of their current worth. My payment will be my own success, built on the ruins of the company that discarded me." It was the audacity of the proposal that sealed it. She wasn't asking for a handout. She was offering him an opportunity, a partnership. She had weaponized her pain and turned it into a meticulously crafted plan for profit and justice. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. He saw the world as a complex series of systems and levers. This woman understood the levers. "There is a gala in 3 weeks," he said, turning back to her. "At the Met. Thorn will be there with his new associate. He will try to humiliate you. He will need to validate his own decision. That will be your test. If you can face him in that room and not break, our alliance begins the next morning." Amelia stood, her composure absolute. "I won't break, Mr. Sterling." "I know," he said, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his dark eyes. He thinks he's in a victory parade. He doesn't realize he's marching into an ambush. The gala, therefore, was not the beginning of her humiliation, but the final step in her recruitment. Her smile, the one that had so confused Marcus and Isabel, was a signal to the man watching from across the room. It was a message that said, "The test is over. The alliance is forged. Let the games begin." The morning after the gala, the city was draped in a cool, grey mist, a fitting backdrop for the quiet war Amelia was about to launch. She didn't feel hungover from champagne, but from adrenaline. The memory of Marcus's confused face and Isabel's faltering arrogance was a potent cocktail, more intoxicating than any drink. Her new beginning wasn't in a gleaming high-rise, but in a modest, elegant office space she had leased in a discreet building in the Flatiron district. It was hers. The name on the frosted glass door was simple: Hayes Advisory Group. There was no fanfare, no announcement in the financial press. The most effective attacks are the ones the enemy never sees coming. Donovan Sterling was true to his word. A wire transfer of seed capital, designated as a consulting retainer, had appeared in her new business account before the banks even officially opened. It wasn't a sum large enough to draw attention, but it was enough. Enough to hire a small, elite team and secure the best data analytics software on the market. Her first target was not a company, but a man, Julian Croft. Julian was the head of risk analysis at Thorn Capital, a quiet genius with an almost poetic understanding of market volatility. He was also chronically underappreciated. Amelia knew that Marcus paid him well, but treated him like a glorified clerk, often publicly dismissing his cautious warnings as pessimistic hand-wringing. Julian was loyal, but his loyalty was to the integrity of the numbers, not to the man who ignored them. He was, in Amelia's assessment, a pillar that looked solid but was ready to crumble. She didn't send a headhunter, she called him herself. "Julian, it's Amelia Hayes." There was a surprised silence on the other end of the line. "Amelia, wow, I'm sorry about everything." "Don't be," she said, her voice warm but direct. "I'm calling with a proposition, not for condolences. I've started my own firm, Hayes Advisory. I'm looking for a partner, not an employee, someone who values foresight over bravado, someone who isn't afraid to tell a client they're about to drive off a cliff." She let the implication hang in the air. She knew Julian had argued fiercely against Marcus's recent massive investment in a German robotics firm, a company whose debt-to-equity ratio was, in Julian's own words, a house of cards in a hurricane. She heard him sigh. Marcus wouldn't listen. "I will," Amelia said simply. "Meet me for coffee, my office, 1 hour." Julian Croft walked into Hayes Advisory Group 58 minutes later. By the end of the day, he had tendered his resignation at Thorn Capital. Marcus's reaction was exactly as Amelia had predicted, rage followed by dismissiveness. He called her, his voice tight with fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Amelia, poaching my top analyst? Is this some pathetic little revenge scheme?" "It's business, Marcus," she replied calmly, picturing him pacing his vast office, his face flushed. "Julian was looking for a new opportunity, and I provided one. You should be happy for him." "Happy for him? He signed an NDA. He can't take anything with him." "I'm not interested in your old data, Marcus," she said, the lie tasting sweet. Julian's encyclopedic knowledge of Thorn Capital's vulnerabilities was her real prize. "I'm interested in his mind, something you clearly undervalued." She hung up before he could respond, a tremor of satisfaction running through her. The first cut had been made. It was small, but it was deep, and it was aimed at Marcus's pride. The second move was even more subtle. Amelia knew Marcus was aggressively courting a lucrative client, the pension fund of a massive old-money manufacturing conglomerate. Marcus's pitch was all about high-yield, aggressive growth. He was promising them the moon. Amelia didn't try to steal the client. Instead, she used her new firm to publish a meticulously researched anonymous white paper on the hidden risks in the European tech sector, specifically the instability of over-leveraged robotics companies. She didn't name Thorn Capital or the German firm, but for anyone who knew where to look, the message was crystal clear. She had the paper discreetly circulated among pension fund managers and financial analysts, including the very ones the conglomerate had on its board. The paper caused a minor stir in the financial community, a ripple of caution. 2 weeks later, news broke that the conglomerate had decided against moving their pension fund to Thorn Capital, citing a desire for a more conservative, risk-averse strategy. Marcus wouldn't be able to trace it back to her directly, but he would feel the sting of the loss. He would be furious, confused. He was a shark that operated on instinct and aggression. He wouldn't understand this kind of psychological warfare. He was fighting a ghost. Sitting in her quiet office, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as dusk fell, Amelia felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the part of herself she had allowed to be buried. Marcus thought she was playing games. He still saw her as his emotional ex-wife, lashing out in pain. He couldn't comprehend that she wasn't playing his game at all. She was playing her own, and she was just getting started. The first few months of Amelia's campaign were a study in precision. Marcus felt the effects not as a direct assault, but as a series of inexplicable misfortunes. A key client lost, a promising deal that soured at the last minute. The unnerving departure of not just Julian Croft, but 2 other rising analysts who followed him to Hayes Advisory. Marcus saw these as isolated incidents, unlucky breaks in an otherwise flawless career. His ego wouldn't allow him to connect the dots, to even conceive that Amelia could be the architect of his troubles. But the pressure began to mount, and it sought a release valve. That valve was his relationship with Isabel. Their life together, which had started as a whirlwind of clandestine hotel meetings and extravagant gifts, was supposed to be the prize. For Isabel, Marcus represented an escape from a life of mediocrity. He was her entry into a world of galas, private jets, and consequence-free luxury. She hadn't signed up for a war. She had signed up for a victory lap. The cracks first appeared over dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant where the food was art and the bill was a mortgage payment. "I saw pictures of Amelia's new office," Isabel said, scrolling through her phone, a slight frown marring her perfect features. "It's so small. It's almost sad." "It's a joke," Marcus grunted, swirling the wine in his glass. He had just spent the afternoon in a tense meeting with his board, explaining why the pension fund deal had collapsed. "She's playing at being a businesswoman to spite me. It'll fold in 6 months. "Still," Isabel pressed, "Julian Croft works for her now. People are talking. They're saying he jumped a sinking ship." Marcus's eyes snapped up from his wine, his good humor vanishing. "What ship is sinking? Thorn Capital just had its second most profitable quarter in history. Who is people?" "Just whispers," Isabel said, shrinking back slightly from his sudden intensity. "At the salon, at lunch. They wonder why your top analyst would leave for her." "He was a glorified bookkeeper," Marcus lied, his voice sharp. "Easily replaced. This conversation is boring." But the whispers followed him. The financial world was a small, incestuous ecosystem. The narrative was shifting. Marcus Thorn, the untouchable titan, was suddenly looking fallible. The aura of invincibility he had so carefully cultivated was beginning to tarnish. The stress made him volatile. He became short-tempered, obsessed with work, and increasingly paranoid. He would spend late nights in his home office poring over reports, trying to find a tangible enemy to fight, but all he found were shadows. Isabel, who had imagined a life of leisurely brunches and romantic getaways, found herself living with a distracted, irritable man who treated her less like a partner and more like a decorative piece of furniture. Her demands for attention, once met with indulgent smiles and expensive jewelry, were now met with annoyance. The breaking point came one evening in their sterile, minimalist penthouse. Isabel came in, flushed with excitement, holding a travel magazine. "Darling, I was thinking," she began, draping herself over the back of his chair. "We never took that trip to Monaco. What about next month? We could stay at the Hôtel de Paris." "I don't have time for Monaco," Marcus snapped, not looking up from his laptop. "We're in the middle of a major play for a controlling stake in Omnicorp. It's a delicate negotiation." "But you promised," she said, her voice turning petulant. "You said we would celebrate." "We'll celebrate when I close the damn deal," he roared, slamming his laptop shut. He stood up, his 6-foot frame towering over her. The easy charm was gone, replaced by a raw, ugly frustration. "Do you have any idea the kind of pressure I'm under? Do you think this empire runs itself? While you're out spending my money on $1,000 shoes, I'm at war." Isabel recoiled, her eyes welling with tears of shock and indignation. "Spending your money? I gave up my entire life for you. I stood by you while you dealt with that bitter shrew of an ex-wife. A shrew who, for all her faults, at least understood what it took to build this company." The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. It was a fatal mistake, and they both knew it. He had invoked the ghost. He had admitted in a moment of rage that Amelia possessed a value that Isabel did not. The silence in the room was deafening. Isabel's face was a mask of cold fury, the illusion of their perfect romance, of her unequivocal victory over Amelia, had been shattered. She wasn't his partner, she was his distraction, and now that he was no longer distracted, she was becoming an annoyance. "Don't you ever," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage, "compare me to her again." She turned and stormed out of the room. Marcus stood alone, the echo of his own words mocking him. He had won Isabel, but he was losing his grip. The cracks in his perfect facade were spreading, and he had the sinking feeling that the entire edifice was built on ground far less stable than he had ever imagined. The war he was fighting wasn't just in the boardroom anymore. It had followed him home. The Omnicorp acquisition was meant to be Marcus's masterpiece. It was a bold, aggressive move to absorb a smaller but highly innovative rival in the logistics technology space. Closing the deal would not only be immensely profitable, it would be a show of force, a definitive statement to the market that Thorn Capital was stronger than ever and that the recent whispers of its decline were unfounded. Marcus poured all his energy and a dangerous amount of liquid capital into the effort, determined to make it his triumphant checkmate. He saw it as the end of the game. For Amelia, it was the opening she had been waiting for. From the moment she'd heard murmurs of Marcus's interest in Omnicorp, she had set her own plan in motion. Julian Croft, with his intimate knowledge of Marcus's risk tolerance, confirmed her suspicions. "He'll over-leverage," Julian had said, pointing at a series of charts in their quiet office. "He's emotionally invested in this. He needs a public win, so he'll be willing to overpay. His ego is driving the negotiation, not his sense." Amelia didn't try to outbid him. That was a brute force tactic, and her methods were surgical. Instead, she and her small team at Hayes Advisory began a deep-dive investigation into Omnicorp, looking for the one thing Marcus, in his haste, would have overlooked. They spent weeks poring over patent filings, international shipping manifests, and technical journals. The discovery was buried in a dense, jargon-filled patent addendum from a subsidiary of Omnicorp based in South Korea. It was a critical software component for their flagship logistics platform, a component they didn't own, but licensed. The patent was held by a small, obscure tech firm in Seoul, a company so insignificant it barely registered on any financial analyst's radar. More importantly, the licensing agreement had a change of control clause. If Omnicorp was acquired, the new parent company would have to renegotiate the licensing terms from scratch. This was the linchpin. This was Marcus's blind spot. Amelia flew to Seoul. She didn't go as a competitor. She went as a potential partner. She met with the founders of the small Korean firm, a pair of brilliant but cash-strapped programmers. She didn't talk about Marcus Thorne or Omnicorp. Instead, she laid out a vision for their technology, showing them applications and markets they had never considered. She offered them a future. Then she made her move. Using a shell corporation funded by Donovan Sterling's Silent Capital, Hayes Advisory acquired a controlling interest in the small Seoul company. The transaction was so minor it didn't make the news. It was a pebble dropped into the ocean, but it was about to create a tsunami. Back in New York, Marcus was in the final stages of the Omnicorp deal. He had bullied the board, promised the sky, and agreed to a price that made his own advisors sweat. The contracts were drawn up. The press release announcing the acquisition was already written. The day before the deal was set to close, Omnicorp's board received a letter. It was from a law firm representing the small, formerly unknown tech firm in Seoul. The letter politely informed them that upon the acquisition by Thorne Capital, the license for their core software component would be terminated. It further stated that the new owners of the patent were not interested in relicensing the technology to any entity associated with Thorne Capital. They were, however, open to exclusive partnerships with other industry leaders. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Without the license, Omnicorp's core product was worthless. The entire valuation of the company collapsed. The deal was dead on arrival. When the news reached Marcus, he was in a board meeting presenting the final numbers. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the message from his legal team. The color drained from his face. He stared at the screen, his mind unable to process the words. It was impossible. A company he had never even heard of had just scuttled $1 billion deal. Within hours, the story leaked to the financial press. Thorne Capital's Omnicorp acquisition collapses over critical patent dispute. The fallout was brutal. Thorne Capital's stock, which had been inflated by the promise of the deal, plummeted by 30% in a single day. Billions in market value evaporated. The board, which had once revered Marcus, was now looking at him with undisguised fury. They demanded an emergency meeting. They wanted to know how their celebrated CEO had missed something so fundamental. How had he walked them and their investors off a cliff? Marcus locked himself in his office, the skyline of New York mocking him through the panoramic windows. He was shaking with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a coincidence. The precision of the attack was too perfect. The timing too devastating. He finally knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, who was behind it. It wasn't a rival firm. It was the ghost. It was the quiet, underestimated woman he had dismissed as an underperforming asset. Amelia had done more than just cost him a deal. She had used his own arrogance as a weapon against him. She had shown his board, his investors, and the entire world that he was not an invincible titan. He was just a man, a reckless and flawed man who had been outmaneuvered by the one person he never even considered a player in the game. The power imbalance had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Desperation is a corrosive acid. For Marcus Thorne, it ate away the last vestiges of his polished charm, leaving behind the raw, snarling ego of a cornered animal. The Omnicorp disaster had triggered a cascade of failures. Lenders were calling in loans, investors were pulling out, and his board was openly discussing his removal. The empire he had built was crumbling around him, and he knew, with sickening clarity, who held the wrecking ball. He showed up at Amelia's office unannounced. He didn't bother with the receptionist, simply pushing past her and striding down the short hallway to the frosted glass door of Amelia's personal office. He threw it open without knocking. Amelia was standing at her window looking out at the city. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She turned slowly, her expression calm, her composure a stark contrast to his disheveled appearance. His tie was loosened, his hair was unkempt, and his eyes were wild with a mixture of fury and fear. This was not the confident, laughing man from the gala. This was a man on the verge of ruin. "You," he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper. This was all you. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice even. "You're trespassing." "Don't play games with me, Amelia," he shouted, taking a step into the room. "The Korean patent, the pension fund, Croft, all of it. You've been systematically trying to destroy me." "I haven't been trying to do anything, Marcus," she replied, her calm infuriating him further. "I've been succeeding. There's a difference." He stared at her, momentarily speechless. The woman standing before him was not the wife he had discarded. She was sharper, more formidable, radiating a quiet strength he had never seen before because he had never bothered to look. His anger suddenly deflated, replaced by a desperate, manipulative gambit. He softened his expression, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he had once used to win her over. "Ames, listen to me," he said, taking another step closer. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. I was a fool. I was arrogant, and I hurt you. I am so sorry." He was trying to rewind time, to find the emotional levers that had once worked on her. He was playing the remorse card, the last refuge of a discovered charlatan. "I miss what we had," he continued, his voice thick with false emotion. "The early days, the two of us against the world. We were a team. We can be again. Stop this, Amelia. Please, we can walk away from this, you and I. We can start over." He was offering her a deal, just as he had offered her a severance package. He still saw her as something to be managed, a problem to be solved with the right combination of words. Amelia listened to his pathetic plea, and she felt nothing. The pain he had caused her was a distant scar, no longer an open wound. The love she once had for him was a chapter in a book she had long since finished reading. This moment wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about closure. It was her redemption. "No, Marcus," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. "We were never a team. I was your strategist, your analyst, and your partner, and you were the man who took all the credit and then told me I was an underperforming asset. You didn't just end our marriage. You tried to erase my entire contribution to your life, to my own life." She walked from the window and stood directly in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "This isn't about us starting over," she continued. "This is about a market correction. You built an empire on a lie, the lie that you did it alone. I'm just showing the world the truth. The foundation was always cracked, and you were too arrogant to see it." His face hardened again as he realized his manipulation had failed. The raw narcissist re-emerged. "You'll be left with nothing. The ashes of my company won't be enough to build your pathetic little firm." A quiet knock sounded on the open door. Both Amelia and Marcus turned. Donovan Sterling stood there, his presence filling the doorway. He didn't look at Marcus. His gaze was fixed on Amelia, a silent question in his eyes. Amelia gave him a small, reassuring nod. Donovan's presence was not a rescue. It was a statement. He was not just her backer, he was her partner. Theirs was an alliance built not on sentiment or history, but on a foundation of mutual respect and shared strategy. He had seen her brilliance from the beginning. "I think you should leave now, Marcus," Amelia said, her voice regaining its finality. The reckoning was over. Marcus looked from Amelia's unwavering face to Donovan's cold, unreadable expression. He saw the silent, impenetrable alliance between them. He was utterly, completely defeated. There were no more moves to make. He had been checked from every angle. Without another word, he turned and walked out, a diminished figure retreating from the field of battle he had so arrogantly started. Amelia watched him go, then turned to Donovan. "It's done," she said. "I know," he replied, his voice low. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning her face, not for weakness, but for confirmation of her strength. "Are you all right?" "I am," Amelia said, and the truth of it settled deep in her bones. "For the first time in a very long time, I really am." The war was over. Now it was time to build. A year later, the view from Amelia's office was different. Hayes' advisory group now occupied the entire 40th floor of a sleek, modern building in Hudson Yards. The minimalist aesthetic wasn't sterile like Marcus's old penthouse. It was intentional, filled with clean lines, warm woods, and vibrant abstract art. It was a space that fostered clarity and focus. It was a space she had built. Her firm had become one of the most sought-after strategic consultancies in the city. Her reputation was built on her almost clairvoyant ability to identify hidden risks and opportunities, the very skills Marcus had dismissed. She didn't command rooms with volume, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of her intellect. She was respected, and more importantly, she respected herself. The financial news ticker on the screen in her office lobby told the final chapter of Marcus Thorne's story. Thorne Capital, crippled by debt and a crisis of confidence, had been broken up and its viable assets sold off. Sterling Industries had acquired the lion's share for pennies on the dollar, a move lauded by the press as a masterstroke of timing. Marcus himself was gone from the public eye, forced into a quiet, ignominious retirement. He was a footnote in the history of the empire he thought he'd built. Isabelle Renault had vanished even faster, her social media accounts deleted, her presence in the high society columns replaced by the next ambitious young woman. Their great us had proven to be as hollow as their promises. Amelia felt no triumph in their demise, only a quiet sense of finality, of balance restored. Her focus was no longer on the past, but on the future she was actively creating. The door to her office opened, and Donovan Sterling walked in. Their relationship had evolved beyond the initial calculated alliance. It had deepened into a partnership that was both professional and personal, though it defied easy labels. It was built on the rare pleasure of two minds that moved at the same speed, that saw the world with the same strategic clarity. There was an easy comfort between them, a shorthand in their silences. He didn't speak, simply handed her a tablet. On the screen was a news alert. Hayes Advisory had just been named the lead strategic partner for a massive new green energy fund, a deal that would not only be incredibly profitable, but would also have a tangible, positive impact. It was the kind of work Amelia had always dreamed of doing, building something meaningful, something that lasted. She looked up at him, a genuine, radiant smile lighting up her face. It was nothing like the calculated, enigmatic smile she had worn at the gala. This one was real, earned, and completely her own. "Good work, Amelia," he said, his own lips curving into a rare, small smile. "Good work, Donovan," she corrected gently. "We did it." He walked to the vast window, looking out at the sprawling city below. Amelia came and stood beside him. The view was endless, a landscape of glass and steel shimmering under the afternoon sun. A year ago, this city had felt like a cage, a place of public humiliation and private grief. Now it felt like a kingdom of possibilities. She was not defined by the man who had tried to break her, nor by the one who had helped her rise. She was defined by her own resilience, her own intellect, her own unyielding refusal to be erased. She had faced the public scorn of an ex-husband and his mistress, endured the laughter, and answered their challenge not with words, but with a quiet, devastating victory that had reshaped her world. She had, in the end, stopped them. And in doing so, she had finally, truly, started her own life. From the ashes of a humiliating confrontation, Amelia Hayes didn't just rise, she rebuilt an empire in her own image. Her story is a powerful reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous, and true power isn't about who laughs the loudest, but who has the last, most meaningful smile. It's a journey from being an underestimated asset to an unstoppable force, proving that the best revenge is not just living well, but strategically dismantling the world of those who wronged you. If Amelia's incredible story of resilience and redemption moved you, show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see that it's never too late to reclaim your power, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories of justice. What would you have done in her place? Let us know in the comments below.